I can't imagine anything being any harder than those 10 days.
Coach Bryant was just so fortunate that we didn't have anyone die.
I think he thought it was a bad idea after he had done it.
It is now legend, but it is a real story rooted in a harsh truth.
It was just a hellhole.
Over 10 grueling days in 100-degree heat, a driven coach, not yet a legend, pushed his players time and again to the brink of endurance and beyond.
I don't think a coach would be like that today. I think he'd probably end up in jail.
2/3 of Bear Bryant's players quit. The players who survived this hell remember the coach who put them through it.
Coach Bryant was a great psychologist. He knew how much people could take.
Nearly half a century later, the town of Junction, Texas has not changed, and neither have the stories the locals still tell.
And the Junction boys, they'd be here and they'd be waiting to get out of here on the first bus.
Bear Bryant, in the movie account, is depicted as ruthless, impervious to the pain and suffering of his players.
You ever sat down and wondered why you gotta be the meanest son of a bitch in the valley?
To the point that one nearly died on the practice field. Is that what really happened? Tonight, meet the players who survived and hear the actual stories from the real Junction boys on a special edition of Outside the Lines. Welcome to Junction in the hill country of West Texas. This is where head coach Paul Bear Bryant brought his Texas A&M football players back in 1954. He arrived with 111 players, and that filled 2 buses. 10 days later, he left Junction with just 35 young men on 1 bus, half full. In a moment, you'll be meeting some of the real-life Junction boys who endured and survived their time here. This is a place to which Bear brought his players sight unseen from College Station on a 5-hour, 300-mile trip to this adjunct campus of Texas A&M and into the teeth of an historic and destructive drought. Even Bryant was shocked at the conditions he encountered. This area had not seen any substantial rain in 4 years and would not for another 3. And so when the Aggie players finally arrived here in Junction, here at their practice field, that field then looked very different than it does now with overgrown grass. In the midst of that drought in 1954, this field was a parched piece of land covered with rocks and small cactus and sand spurs. It was only the next morning that Bear Bryant, portrayed in the movie by Tom Berenger, told his team how determined he was, one way or another, to test the stamina and eventually the character of his football players.
Boys, I don't care who your daddy is. I don't care what all-conference bull you were in high school. I don't care what the last coach promised you. We're going to work now. Coaches, gassers, line up, back!
So began Bear Bryant's test of his players' will that defined the Junction boys. There is the movie account, and then there is the reality of those 10 days in Junction, captured in these rare home movies from 1954, taken on picture day when the media was invited into the midst of a week when Bryant's Aggie players were put through 2-a-days in 100-degree heat. 48 years later, the memories and the stories endure, and now is our chance to hear them. I am joined by 5 of the Junction boys, survivors of that legendary camp. Bill Schrader was a junior, a tackle, and it is Bill who nearly died from heat stroke in Junction. Dennis Gehring was a sophomore, the never-say-die guard that Bryant just could not run off. Elwood Kettler was Bear Bryant's quarterback. That was his senior season, and Elwood practiced in Junction with a broken back. Gene Stallings was the consummate team player, a sophomore that year. He succeeded eventually Bryant as head coach at both Texas A&M and Alabama. And Henry Clark was a junior tackle when Bear Bryant took his players to Junction. Gentlemen, all welcome. It's great to be with you. You've had 48 years to deal with the memories and now to look at the movie. How closely, if at all, did this movie capture the essence of those 10 days?
Bob, I think one thing you've got to understand is that those of us that were there, we're going to look at it a little more critically than the people that just are looking at it on television. So things that we see and things that they see is not really going to be the the same thing. And I think that's important that the viewers understand that, because, you know, we were there, and some things that we recognized, some things we didn't.
Well, what didn't you recognize?
Well, one thing, I didn't recognize some of the language. You know, I heard some things that I never did here at Junction. I didn't recognize Smokey Harper. I mean, that wasn't Smokey Harper. That's just the very bottom line, I guess, is that the facilities weren't that bad, and maybe the practice really wasn't that tough.
Was it that tough, though, Elwood?
Well,
yeah, you had a broken back.
Yeah, well, I broke my back in the spring of the year. I re-broke the cartilage that hold the bones together the day of Junction, which was painful. So the doctor told me then, says if you can play with pain, you can play. But, you know, Coach Bryant asked me one time when I was at Alabama about Junction with a bunch of people around, what was so bad about it. And I said, well, I think what was bad about it was that we had a practice schedule for 120 people, only 25 of us practicing.
but the image, Dennis, that we have is this coach that basically the players were in fear of, who day by day more and more of the guys left until there were only 35 of you left. And this brutality, this violence that was captured in the movie, is that your recollection?
Well, you got to understand that Coach Bryant was a disciplinary coach, and he wanted to get performance out of us. And most of the guys had never been acclimated to that kind of coaching, so that was a little bit different for us, and I think a lot of guys thought that was really tough, but he was tough, but he was fair. I don't think he was ever really unfair to the extent that we didn't learn something out of everything that he did.
I do not think that Coach Bryant would have gone to Junction had he known the facilities were as poor as they were. I really, now, we never talked about it at Alabama when I was coaching for him, but knowing him, he wanted a good place to practice. He wanted the players to have a good place to sleep and a good place to eat. Now, that was important to him.
But he told me when I was working in Alabama, when he first drove up to Junction, he said he wanted to puke. He had no idea it was that bad. And, of course, he couldn't turn the bus around. But one of the things that I remember and that I liked was that, and I liked it because Coach Bryant, if you thought you were better than the guy in front of you or ahead of you, you had a challenge drill. In other words, you could challenge the guy.
And everybody came around and
everybody got around and watched.
How would it work?
And
how would that work?
Well, well, for example, Marvin Tate was one of the guards, okay? And if I wanted to challenge Marvin Tate, I would. And in fact, one particular day, we had this challenge, and we ended up getting into a fight. And Coach Bryant was watching it, and he finally said, hey, break those guys up. They're just stirring up dust. They're not fighting. but you could challenge.
Right, and you'd change shirts right there.
Yeah,
I mean,
right
if
there.
Dennis had a red shirt on and he was challenging the guy that had a white shirt on and he won, hey, right there in front of everybody, you'd take the shirt off, and then you would go to the next team. And the guy that lost the challenge, and all the players would get in a circle and would watch this. He would assign 3 coaches to be the judges. And basically, it was blocking drill. I'd block Dennis 3 times. Dennis would block me 3 times. And that was basically what the challenge drill was. They decided who did it the best. Now, that didn't mean that you were going to stay on that team forever, but it meant that you were on that team for a while.
You had a chance.
For at least a day.
That's right, for at least a day.
For at least a day.
Henry, how tough did you find this camp?
I didn't find it tough at all. I mean, it was hard. It was hard. But, again, it was fair. It was fair.
Well, one of the things that is in the book and also portrayed in the movie is a headbutting incident that Coach Bryant came over. In the book, it is portrayed as you, Jim Dent's reporting, and there's a composite character in the movie. Let's take a look at the way it's portrayed in the movie.
What, you puke? Why is your hat off? And you, Gerhardt, you hit like a queer. I ain't done with you, boy. Get down there and 4-point this. Go on. Fine.
That's the way it's portrayed in the movie. In the book, Jim Dent reports that's you.
It didn't happen.
Did it, guys?
The broken nose.
Not the broken nose.
It happened in that I wasn't getting low enough to keep from getting blocked by the 2 people on the other side. And there was 2 people on the other side, by the way, instead of just 1.
Was that during spring training, though, wasn't it?
But that's another thing.
That's
See,
right.
this incident occurred in spring training before we went to Junction. But anyway, my nose was never broken. There was never any blood. that I can remember coming up or coming out of my face or lips or nose.
He never hit you in the head?
Oh, yes. He hit me in the head. But see, the thing is, we didn't have face masks then. We were free meat, I guess you might say. And I got a bunch of gray hair in my teeth from that, him butting me in the head.
Given the fact that, Henry, you say that as reported in the book, this did not happen. Also, in the epilogue of the book, you're reported as being deceased, and we're very happy to see that that's not the case. What conclusions do you draw about the credibility in the entire book?
Well, I'll say this. A lot of the incidents in the book, the ones I've read and heard about, I think were based on fact, but they were well overblown.
They were embellished.
Yes.
You know, and when you're writing a book to make a movie, you're going to embellish it just a little bit. And I think all of us recognize that. Just like Dennis mentioned a little earlier, Coach Bryant was tough, but he was fair. There's nothing in the movie that makes you wonder why we love Coach Bryant the way that we did. If he was like that and it was over, it had to be more to it than that.
And what was the more to it?
There was he cared for us. Yeah. He wanted us to graduate, to play, to be successful. The movie sort of portrays that he didn't care whether or not we had good medical attention. That's not right. Now, there may have been better trainers than Smokey, but Smokey was never drunk. He did the best he could to get the player back on the field, and he didn't ever ask you to go back on the field if it were dangerous. Just like you said, Elwood, if he could handle the pain, practice.
The day after Coach kind of jumped on me for being hurt, then he found out I was really hurt. And he came and had big tears in his eyes. I mean, he really felt bad about it. He really felt bad about it because they thought at that time I might have a bursted kidney. And he was really concerned about it.
I think these practices in 100-degree heat, obviously 2 a days. For example, Bill, how much weight would you guys lose in the course of a day or two?
Well, of course, in particular the day that I had the heat stroke, I lost 20-plus pounds that particular day, which I never did gain back again. So it did have certainly some impact on my stamina and my ability to do the work that I would like to have been doing as far as practicing and playing in games was concerned.
Now, you mentioned the heat stroke. Let's take a look at how that is portrayed in the movie, and I want to get your recollections, and all of you, of that fateful day in Junction.
Luke Mason! Well, get up, damn it! Oh, man. You bastard! Hey! Easy, come on, easy. Look right.
Pulse is 300 beats a minute. Is that a record? What's that mean?
It means he's dying.
I think the heat stroke is disturbing, as portrayed again in the book and also there in the movie, that Coach Bryant came over and applied a kick. Now, you guys were there, and you, of course, were unconscious at the time. Did the kick occur?
I don't know.
I don't know.
I didn't see it.
I didn't see it. No. I didn't see it.
I don't remember that. I would certainly doubt it because I can't. You know, I coached for Coach Bryant for 7 years at Alabama, and I never saw him in what I thought he mistreated a player. He tried to get our attention from time to time, which he did, but I just can't imagine that happening. Bill, did you feel anything? Or?
No, I was unconscious at the time, Gene, and I knew nothing about what might have occurred insofar as that particular incident is concerned. So I have no way of, saying what did occur or what did not occur at that particular time.
But how did the heat stroke change camp? How did what happened to Bill Dennis? Did Coach change? Did the tenor of camp change?
Oh, yeah, I think the coaches made a decision that we need to go back to College Station, and that's what we did.
It's an obvious question, but I'd love to hear how you would express it. If you had a son or a grandson, and there was a Paul Bryant out there doing today what essentially was doing then, would you, Henry, have him play for you?
No.
No?
No.
Why?
I think times have changed. I don't think a coach would be like that today. I think he'd probably end up in jail.
See, I feel entirely different. I coached for Coach Bryant for 7 years. Most of the time, I tell a kid, don't go to college because of the coach. Because the coach can die, he can get fired or he can move on. But when I was working for Coach Bryant, I felt like it was to the players' advantage to be associated with Coach Bryant for 4 years. I really believe that. One of the reasons I was a good recruiter for him, because I really believe that.
He adapted to the times, though? As Henry said, that wouldn't fly now. He wouldn't want his son or his grandson to play anymore.
You know, he had 2 bad years.
I'm talking about Junction only.
Yeah.
I'm talking about Junction. I wouldn't want anybody to go through
Would
what
any
we
coach
went through.
do today? I mean, you might get a little bit water now in 2002, but could any coach today do what Coach Bryant did in Junction?
No.
Well, close. I mean, you know, you look at any training camp.
Yeah, it's tough.
And they're tough. I
Yeah.
mean, you don't practice as long, and you give them some water, and the facilities were better. But Elwood and I have coached for a long time, and the thing that I worried about when I was coaching was a heat stroke. I mean, you've got to practice. You've got to get them ready to play, and there's no easy way to do it.
How much did what happened to Bill affect your coaching philosophy?
It scared me to death.
So it stayed with you for decades.
Oh, it still does. I mean, when I retired, one of the things that I was so glad that I never had a player die, you know, because I'm telling you, it can happen. No fault of Bill's and no fault of Coach Bryant's. I mean, sometimes it can just happen. And I don't think I would have ever gotten over that as a coach.
We'll be back with you guys a little bit later in the program to hear more about the 1979 reunion, but ahead on Outside the Lines, we'll be looking at Paul Bryant's life to see what forged the will that he imposed on his players. And next, we return to Junction to meet the man who was a 17-year-old working at the bus station, wrote the tickets for those players desperate to escape from their coach.
They'd come in and ask to buy tickets, and I'd say, which way do you want to go? And most of them didn't care which way they went. They wanted the first bus out of here.
Plus, the man who wrote the Junction Boys says his reporting proves this headbutt did take place as portrayed in the movie, despite the denial of Henry Clark.
Henry Clark has a bad memory.
This is virtually unchanged, almost, this downtown area. It's just like it was in 1954.
Rob Roy Spiller is the president of the Junction National Bank, a leading citizen in this town of 2,000 people. Back in 1954, when he was 17, he worked in this building at the Junction bus station. Just about each day of Bear Bryant's brutal 10-day training camp, Spiller arrived at work in the morning to find Aggie players who had run out of camp under cover of darkness.
And over here against this wall, this rock wall right here, most mornings would be several worn-out players from the adjunct and the Junction boys. They'd be here and they'd be waiting to get out of here on the first bus.
After several days, Bryant brought his players to this high school field in Junction that also served as a rodeo arena. The players practiced as townfolk watched.
They used this after 2 or 3 days practicing out at the adjunct, and oh, it was tough and hot, and they came over here and did some scrimmages in the evening, and I knew that they were going through rough times because you could tell by watching the scrimmages, and I saw a lot of them quit out there, just walk off the field.
The ordeal of the practices on that field began to come to life because of some late-night stories shared by one of the survivors of that time here in Junction. Author Jim Dent is the man who began to uncover the history of the real Junction boys. Gene Stallings spent 14 years as an assistant under Dallas coach Tom Landry. In that time, the author of the Junction boys, Jim Dent, was a Cowboys beat writer, and the two men spent time together after hours at training camp.
We were in Thousand Oaks 6 weeks every year with the Cowboys, and you had time on your hands. So it was time for storytelling. And Gene Stallings is one of the best storytellers I've ever met in my life. And that's when he started telling me the stories about the Junction boys. It didn't register at that point that it would be a book, but I did file that stuff away and kept it for a better day.
You wrote something in the book, and I think it really gets to the heart of why you believe, and perhaps the reality of why these guys stayed. You wrote, each survivor knew he had no better place to go. What were you trying to say?
They had no place to go back to work. I mean, their families, were losing homes. Fathers didn't have jobs that held 2 or 3 years earlier.
It was desperation in their lives.
I don't think there's any question that desperation is the word that kept a lot of the guys in Junction. I think almost to a man, they looked themselves in the mirror and said, hey, I've got to play football for Bear Bryant. I've got to keep my scholarship, or I'm going to end up breaking rocks or digging ditches and doing something I don't want to do. Some of the guys who quit, some of the guys who Bryant ran off, actually, are very bitter about what happened.
Do they speak openly about it?
Yes, they
because
do.
you're dealing with a major legend here and who's been gone now for 20 years, and sometimes you might think, well, you don't want to speak ill of someone who's gone and someone who's so large a legend.
Some of them have. In fact, one of the survivors was Charles Hall, who went on to become a veterinary teacher, professor at Texas A&M. And even though he survived, he made the 10 days, he hated Bryant. And he spoke openly about the fact that he felt abused. He was one of the players who got married the summer before the Hell Camp, and Bryant really rode him very, very hard. But Charles Hall wanted to go to vet school, and losing his scholarship would have meant that he would not have finished his BS degree.
When you say bitterness, was it, how could he have done this to me? It was, he had no empathy for me. He didn't understand what was happening. How did they express it?
He's not trying to make me a better football player. He's trying to hurt me. He's trying to run me off. That was the general feeling of the guys who left. They didn't feel like that he was interested in making them a good football player or a better football team, just that he was an abusive man who had come out of nowhere.
Now, as you talked to the survivors and also to those that were there for a while and didn't last, what were some of the things that shocked you and surprised you?
The fact that Bryant kicked Billy Schrader when he was down, that's one thing that worries me about the story a little bit, is that the brutality is celebrated a little bit. And it's kind of sad, but you also got to understand that the players who were brutalized actually felt that that helped build their character and helped bond them and helped forge the championship.
Now, in your book, you have an epilogue where you talk about the players and what they're doing now. You've listed Henry Clark in one edition as being deceased. And, of course, last week he says, no, I'm not. Would you like to address that?
Yeah, I mean, you make mistakes when you write a book, and I regret the fact that Henry Clark ended up dead in my book. I also hated the fact that he waited 3 years to finally step forward. I think if somebody had said that Jim Dent was dead, I think I would have gotten on the phone and made that correction.
But not only does Henry say, no, wait a minute, I'm alive, he says you portray in the book the story, it's also in the movie, of the headbutt. Henry Clark says the entire headbutting incident didn't happen.
Henry Clark has a bad memory. Henry Clark knows that it happened. There were players there who saw it, including Charles Hall, who's one of the players who almost quit. I had several sources tell me that it happened. I don't understand why Henry had to wait 3 years to suddenly come up with the fact that this did not happen when the book came out in 1999. Henry, where have you been?
Jim Dent, the author of The Junction Boys. Okay, Henry, I want to give you a chance. We know where you have been. You're not deceased. You're with us. But please respond to Jim. Why did it take 3 years?
Well, I never knew he even wrote a book. Why should I know he wrote a book?
Mm-hmm. But he says, again, not to harp on it, but he says he has sources that you were indeed headbutted by Bear.
I talked to Charlie Hall. Charlie Hall is from Dallas, and he and I used to ride back and forth all the time together whenever somebody was coming that had a car. But Charlie Hall says that never happened. Mm-hmm. And everybody that I've talked to in the last day said it never happened. And not only that, it didn't happen at Junction. It happened at the initial truth was that he was showing me how to get underneath blocking people, and he came up underneath my helmet and hit me in the face. And the only thing I remember was got gray hair in my teeth. That's it.
Let me pick up on another one of Jim's points about the Junction Boys, or I guess they wouldn't be considered Junction Boys. They didn't last. They didn't stick out the 10 days. He talks about a great deal of bitterness on their part. Do any of you talk to any of those guys who went out but didn't come back on that one bus? And is there bitterness?
Well, I've talked to several of them. You know, Gene and I, we coached a long time. I coached for 37 years, and there's a lot of reasons why a young man stopped playing football or any other sport. You know, marriage, work, just don't like to play any longer, and so forth and so on. And some of them wasn't going to play. They knew that too. So I have not talked to any one of them that is really bitter about Junction. Someone else may have, but not me.
I think this particular camp required the type of person who was not going to quit, who had no thoughts about quitting, who during their lives, in some respects, probably had, and I always kind of refer to it as stick-to-itiveness, but the kind of situation where I'm not going to leave voluntarily. I don't care what happens. We're not going to leave voluntarily. We're going to do what we have to do to make this team or to basically accomplish whatever it is we're trying to do.
You know, quitting was never an option for me. I don't think it's an option. Was it hard? Yes, it was hard. Was it tough? But football's tough. Football's hard. I never even gave quitting a thought.
Never.
Never. But now, when that bus would go into town, and it would go around that circle and go over that river, I really, down deep, wanted that bus brakes to fail, and I wanted us to go out across there and all drown. That would have been an honorable way out. You know, I did, but it never happened. But as far as the thing about quitting, I didn't ever. But here's the thing about coaching you've got to remember. You know, you remember the guys that stay. You don't remember the guys that leave. I mean, the game is still for the players. Sometimes we think the game's for the coaches. Game's not for the coaches. Game's for the players. And those guys that leave, as Elwood said, for whatever reason, hey, they leave. But you give your time to the guys that stay.
And we'll be back with the Junction Boys a little bit later in this hour. But when we continue, we go back into the early years of the life of Paul Bear Bryant and what created his character.
The city kids, as Coach Bryant referred to the ones in Fordyce, would taunt him and make fun of him. He was barefooted and wearing old jeans, and it ate at him. It gnawed at him his whole life.
No water, not during practice. 2 teams on the football field, and we're going to be the only ones left standing in the 4th quarter. Come on, Luke, get it out of here.
He's going to cook us in this oven.
Heat was a constant demon inside the Quonset huts where the Aggie players lived. These are the actual World War II huts where they did sleep, and they're still in use today here in Junction. The boys would come back from the morning practice, exhausted, trying to nap, with the temperature outside approaching 100 degrees, even hotter inside here. There were no fans, and with 12 players in each hut, the searing heat persisted into nighttime. Some players would fall into a nearby stream in full pads and simply lie there for a long spell, trying to cool down and recover from being pushed again to the limit. What sort of coach would drive his players so hard? Jeremy Schaap examines how Paul Bryant came to this moment in time.
Legendary sports figure is dead tonight. College football's winningest coach.
Bear Bryant died today of a massive heart attack in an Alabama
Teams
hospital.
at Alabama won 6 national championships.
Bryant
The Bear
retired
led his
as
team
head coach at the University of Alabama just last month. Bear Bryant won 323 games.
And we're in the nation's top 10 19 times. Winning meant a lot to Bear Bryant.
Winning meant so much to Bear Bryant because his life had been so hard. Born in tiny Morro Bottom, Arkansas in 1913, he was the 11th of 12 children. 3 of them died as infants. Bryant's father, Monroe, was an invalid whose religious beliefs prevented him from seeking medical assistance. The Bryants didn't believe in doctors, which might help explain why Bryant rarely felt his players needed them. But even if the Bryants had believed in doctors, they couldn't have easily afforded one.
I think when you think about Bear Bryant, you first have to think about his humble beginnings, the fact that he really didn't have anything.
One of the humiliating experiences of his childhood, he never forgot it, was riding in the back of a wooden, rickety old vegetable cart drawn by a donkey. His mother driving the donkey, and Coach Bryant sitting in back with the fruit and vegetables they were taking into town to sell at the market.
With his father's health in decline, Bryant's mother moved the family to Fordyce, Arkansas, a larger town a few miles down the road from Morro Bottom.
And the city kids, as Coach Bryant referred to the ones in Fordyce, would taunt him and make fun of him. He was barefooted and wearing old jeans, and I'm sure they were ill-fitting. And it ate at him, it gnawed at him his whole life.
He grew up listening to the voices of the boys in town, the kids in town who said, you're not anything in this world.
I think it affected him his entire life. I think he got up earlier and stayed later because of it.
Stung by the taunts of his classmates, Bryant expressed his anger with his fists. He was often in fights. When he was 13, he was already 6'3" and beat up a grown man. His toughness also earned him a nickname.
When the Carnival Man came to Fordyce, Arkansas, and asked for a volunteer to wrestle the bear, only one guy raised his hand, and that was Bear Bryant.
As an aggressive end who played both offense and defense, Bryant found the perfect release for his frustrations. The teams he played on at Alabama featured several players more gifted than Bryant, but none tougher. During his senior season, he played an entire game on a broken leg.
Coach Bryant was the toughest man I've ever met. He was the John Wayne of college football coaches.
The man who dragged all those Aggies to hell and back in 1954 was also shaped by his experiences in the Navy in World War II. When his ship was rammed, Bryant survived, though 200 shipmates died. A hard man was made even harder, as those who played for him would soon find out.
Coach Bryant had his way, which was the reflection of his background and the rough and tumble growing up period that he had, and he went about doing it the only way he knew how.
Jeremy Schaap. To consider the man who won more college games than any other in his lifetime, we welcome Mickey Herskowitz. As a Cub reporter for the Houston Post, he was in Junction from the first days of camp. He has also authored a book on Bear Bryant. John Underwood co-authored a magazine series with Bear Bryant, later a book on Bryant's hard life and good times, and Gene Stallings rejoins us as well. Gentlemen, all welcome again. What made this guy so demanding and so tough?
Well, you could start with a lot of things, but I think you got to go all the way back to what he came from. He came from Morro Bottoms, Arkansas. Tough life. Remembered riding on the back of a wagon with his mama into the roughest, toughest districts, selling fruits and vegetables in the dead of winter. And I think coming out of that, he had a sensitivity for life and really a devotion to hard work that followed through all the way to the end, really.
One of Coach Bryant's real secrets, not a secret, but everybody wanted to please Coach Bryant. Players, we would do anything just to hear him say, hey, good job.
And that's because, though, he's pushing you physically,
but,
testing you mentally.
But alumni wanted to please him, too, and he didn't push them. Presidents wanted to push him. Wanted to please him. He didn't push them.
But could you understand in the midst, for example, of those 10 days in Junction, even though you're a young guy, did you have some understanding of what this was for, what this was about, what his grander purpose was?
No, not really. We were sophomores in college. You know, we were getting ready for the season. To look in, I can look at it now and sort of see some of his reasons, but all I was trying to do was survive. You know, I wanted to survive that practice and get ready for the next one and survive that one and eventually go back home. So no, I didn't look into that. Well, say this about Mickey. Now Mickey, not only did he cover us at Junction, but he covered us during our entire stint at A&M. He was on my television show. What a great host he was there. And his first interview with Coach Bryant at Junction, and I felt like the movie should have shown this. He goes up to Coach Bryant, and he's just out of the University of Houston, and he says, Coach, I understand there's some dissension down here. And Coach Bryant said, well, if there's not, there's going to be, because I'm going to cause it. And that was the end of the interview. And that was Mickey's first really interview with Coach Bryant.
Well, you were 19, and you were phoning in your first story from that first day of what you, to your unpracticed eye at the moment, appeared to be a very brutal practice. Tell what happened.
It was a full contact scrimmage, and unfortunately, I had to phone in my stories every day because there wasn't any other medium or Western Union operation from Junction, Texas, to get my story into the office. And as luck would have it, the only pay phone on the property was located on the wall of the building where the coaches had their meetings. But anyway, I started dictating my story, and I realized about halfway through it got real quiet in that hut. And I didn't know what to think about that, but I finished my story, hung up the phone, turned around, and there was a manager standing there. He said, Mickey, Coach Bryant would like to see you. And I swallowed real hard, and I followed him back into that hut, and everybody cleared out, just Coach Bryant sitting behind this desk, and he asked me to have a seat. He said, Mickey, did I hear you talking on the phone? He said, and I wasn't eavesdropping, just real hard not to hear you, just on the other side of this thin wall, plywood wall. He said, Did I hear you talking about bones being crushed and people being mangled and maimed and headbutting and blocking and tackling and bloodletting? And I thought, well, some of that sounds familiar, Coach. And he said, well, let me tell you. He said, those mamas and papas out there read that, they're going to think we're just, wrecking their sons. And that's not what we went through at all. What we did today was we call that dummy drills. So you really, ought to think about correcting your story. And so I had to sort of summon up a good amount of nerve, and I went back to the payphone, and I did a little light editing, as John might understand that, on my story to meet Coach Bryant's specifications. And I was embarrassed by it for a long time, but I'll say this. It was never easy to say no to Coach Bryant.
Well, what did his image mean to him? Did it matter to him how he was portrayed? I mean, he was a public figure. How did he take to the fame? I mean, here's a mythic figure in American sports.
I think a defining element of Bryant was ego. There's no doubt that he had a large ego, but he used it in the right ways for the most part. But he wanted to be thought of as what he was. I mean, the hat at Alabama.
And everybody knew him, but Jimmy Hinton tells a story that he said they were in San Antonio and they called a cab and it didn't go very far. And Coach Brown said, Jimmy, you pay the tab. And he gave him $2 or $3 tip. And he said, Jimmy, give him $10 tip. Well, Jimmy gave him a $10 tip. And he said, Coach said, we didn't go very far. I tipped the guy $3. And he said, listen, they don't know you, but they know me. so his image was important to him. He knew when he was on stage.
As Jim Dent mentions in his book, the way of recruiting in those days, putting good teams together, there was long green involved. There was cash for recruits. How much of that was he aware of and knew of at the time and was part of the common currency of just, we knew this was going on?
Bryant said in the book that we did, he said, you have to understand that from place to place you have different circumstances. And at Alabama, it was a lot different than it was at Kentucky or at Texas A&M. But his remark on that score was, you have to meet the competition. Yeah. And meeting the competition at Texas A&M and maybe even at Kentucky, I don't know that. I don't remember that. But was to get help somewhere. And sometimes it came from alumni that he would encourage. Yes, there was money passed, sure.
Bob,
wait a minute. Let's finish on that right there. I coached at Alabama the first 7 years we were at Alabama. And he had a staff meeting, and he said that if I ever hear of one person cheating on any player, you are fired on the spot.
Oh, that's what I'm saying. He said when he got to Alabama, he told me, he said, at Alabama, we didn't have to.
Yeah, I don't know about A&M. I know I didn't get anything. Obviously, something happened because we were on probation. But as far as anybody flaunting it or anything like that, I never experienced it at all. And obviously, it was none at Alabama while I was there.
No, he made it a point of that. Right. In fact, at Alabama, he wouldn't even take a salary any higher than the head of any department. Head of the English department, head of the math department, whatever.
His choice?
His choice. Now, he said, by the same token, he says, I want to be able to make my own TV deal.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much. Next up, we'll meet the other of the real Junction boys who became a head coach in the National Football League and the only one to play in the NFL. As a player, Jack Pardee was the best-known Junction boy, and he could play. 15 seasons in the NFL with the LA Rams and the famed over-the-hill gang of Redskins. And Jack Pardee could coach, a winning pro coach for over 20 years. Success with its roots in those 10 days in Junction under Bear Bryant.
Yeah, Junction was a terrible experience. I sure wouldn't want to do it now. But then, I really didn't know much difference.
Back then, Jack Pardee was a strapping sophomore, shaped by summers of grueling work in West Texas oil fields. In Junction, for the first time, he would work out with the Aggie varsity.
As we left College Station that morning, I was probably listed as the 5th or 6th or 7th team fullback and linebacker on the team. Well, as the players started quitting, walking off and bailing out at night or whatever, leaving, well, Coach Bryant saw something in me that he thought I could play.
In fact, through that week and a half, Bryant came to prize Pardee as the player most able to shoulder the load of those brutal workouts.
People ask me, did I consider leaving or quitting myself? And I've really never crossed my mind. My parents would have been harder on me than Coach Bryant. So what was I going to go leave Junction, go to Christoval and work in the oil field, or be a roughneck on an oil derrick? You know, there wasn't a lot of alternatives.
Today, raising cattle on his ranch just 4 hours from Junction, Pardee cherishes the life lessons imparted in the dust and the hellish heat of that training camp.
I learned more from that experience in Junction in 10 days than all the rest of my career combined. I think number one thing is how do you survive? And what Coach Bryant taught us to do was not to be a quitter, not to give up, to get ready for life. That life really isn't all that easy. And that's what Coach Bryant was trying to get us ready for at Junction.
Jack Pardee was, by many accounts, the toughest of the Junction boys. When we return, I will continue my conversation with some of the survivors of Bear Bryant's camp, including recollections of that day 25 years later when the coach returned, intending to apologize to his players.
Oh, look here, stick by me, would you? I'm scared I might forget someone's name.
Coach. Coach, I'm sure you remember.
Johnny Haynes.
My God, I didn't know if you were gonna hit me or hug me.
Good to see you, Coach.
The cinematic portrayal of that reunion back in 1979. I'm rejoined by 5 of the Junction boys. The movie shows a Coach Bryant that came to town thinking that he might have to apologize. Was that the way it went?
I think so. I was one of the guys that kind of organized. I was president of the bank and access to the Letterman Association to file. So I kind of got everybody together, lined them up, and got them out there. And I remember Coach Bryant, we picked him up at the airport, and we were at the motel, and he said, all right, now, Dennis, stand next to me because I want you to make sure that I remember all these guys, and if I make a mistake, tell me. He said, be sure and stand next to me because when Schrader comes, I don't know what he's going to do. And I said, oh, you'll be okay, Coach. And so that was accurate. That was very real, and I thought they did a good job of that.
What was that moment like, seeing Coach again for you, having been so close to death, and it's such a seminal moment apparently in his career?
Well, really, actually, I was looking forward to the opportunity. Certainly there was some concern on my part, I guess, because I had not talked to and seen Coach Bryant for all those many years. And Coach Bryant came towards me, and that's when he said to me, he said, basically, Bill, I'm not sure whether you're going to hit me or hug me. And of course I assured him that I was going to hug him. I gave him a big hug and he gave me a hug back. And you know, that gesture right there and that time together just simply took all the other away. The concerns about not being able to play that season, probably some feelings about the fact that I didn't think it was completely fair not to have the opportunity to do so. And I had a longing, and I didn't follow up on it, to visit with him at some point and speak with him at some point. And time marched on, and it gave me an opportunity to do that.
Well, when you heard Coach say that I came here today maybe thinking I'd have to apologize, what went through your mind when you heard him make a statement like that?
Well, it really is hard to say because, you know, he went there on a purpose. He had a purpose at Junction. And I talked to him several times about this, and he said several times to me, he said, I might have made a mistake at Junction. But later on, when he got there and saw that he had a lot of successful people, you know, all over the United States, all over the world, he said, maybe I did make a mistake.
Well, these fellows had 30 teammates who also made it through those 10 legendary days. When we continue, we will see what the other real Junction boys did with their lives. The players who survived their time in Junction were changed by the experience. Those who were sophomores within 2 years had become conference champions, as Bear Bryant predicted they would. And almost all the players who survived that camp recall that time as a fateful passage in their life, shaping what they would become in the years ahead, even though they would always be known as the Junction Boys. I'm Bob Lee.